Thank you all for joining us. I'm Ruchika. I'm with IRC. I'm part of the WASH Systems for Health project, along with University of Leeds and the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. It's supported by WHO, this particular project. And this session is in collaboration with various other organizations, the implementing partners of this project, but also SWA, Agenda for Change, Emory University, yes, and other people who will come up during the session. Sorry, I missed out, if I missed out someone. So I'm just going to take 5 to 6 minutes to give a bit of a brief overview with respect to why we're talking about gender equity in system strengthening. Some of you already working on it, some are not. So we're just doing a high-level overview, so not getting into too much detail. Just start off with why we're talking about it, who exactly are we talking about, and how do we want to go about looking at system strengthening, keeping gender and social inclusion in the center of it. So we know there's the Human Rights for Water and Sanitation. That was a resolution in 2010 in the General Assembly of the UN. It tells us about what the right to water, right to sanitation include, but also it talks about physical presence not being adequate. The service should be there. So it has to be affordable, it has to be functional, but also it talks about non-discrimination. This is where the system strengthening part becomes important for us. For governments, it proposes that governments should keep a human rights-based approach, that is, that the government is a duty bearer and the right holders. So the duty bearer requires to provide these services, these human rights, and the fact that the right holders can demand for this. Human rights need to have a pro-poor focus. We have the example of Bangladesh, which has a pro-poor policy, various other countries which have even it mentioned in the legislation. We have a challenge with respect to the implementation of these. There are barriers to water and sanitation, and these need to be planned and overcome by governments. So these could be structural, cultural barriers, but also man-made barriers in terms of war. These need to be planned for and accommodated in terms of providing these services. And this is all key for us to achieve the SDGs. Just with respect to a couple of words that we come across when we talk about social inclusion, I'm taking an example to explain this from water and sanitation. So inequality is when there are certain communities or certain households do not have access to water. And then there are efforts that are made by government to provide services, but often, for example, if there's a lower caste community, they're often outside the peripheries of the village and they still do not have access. So it is required that additional efforts are made to reach these households. Often they cannot afford to even provide for connection fees or tariffs, so other options with respect to subsidizing need to be considered. And we need to be looking at, hopefully, structural justice over a period of time where people's needs are considered in the center right from the start. With respect to certain indices, we already know that globally gender is an issue. There are other groups, people with disabilities and various other groups that are there that are marginalized. But just taking the example of gender, there are various indices that show us with respect to where various countries stand for access to health, education, political and economic empowerment. These are just examples that we've taken of the 6 countries where this particular project is in, and we see how these countries actually fare. So looking at who actually is excluded, and we've mentioned women and girls, and then there are obviously other marginalized communities which are more specific to each country and within the country. And within this, it's important to know that there are other aspects. So it's who you are and then where you come from, which add to the levels of discrimination and marginalization. And that's intersectionality, and I think in the panel we'll be covering that bit. And this is my attempt visually to capture the intersectionality. Not so good, but Yeah. Okay. Again, why are we again talking about Jay-Z in WASH system strengthening? Often when we look at interventions, it comes as an afterthought. We've covered the whole population, these people are left behind. We need to be changing that. While it's there in policy, how do we, for countries where it's then there in policy, how do we actually roll it out in a way that it's the center in terms of the planning processes and not an afterthought? And then often you're out of funds and various other issues are there. Also with respect to planning, so if these communities are there in the center of planning, are part of institutions, are influencing through various other learning forums, then the planning also happens in a way to accommodate and have services in the way that they are accessible. How do we propose going about it? So this is just a brief bit that we've put in, not the whole bit, but just in terms of the need for policies to acknowledge which are the marginalized groups that are not having access, to clearly acknowledge them and put in various provisions that are required. Could be subsidies, could be quotas, whatever it may be required for that context. That policy needs to capture that. Experience from Bangladesh and India would be definitely the focus needs to be on the policy implementation quite a bit. Institutions, if you look at the broad pillars of bureaucracy, technocrats, and elected representatives, we need to make sure there is representation of these various groups in these institutions, especially elected representatives. We know there are certain percentages that are required in these various local governments. The challenge we have is with respect to tokenistic participation. And it's similar with respect to planning. We need to accommodate what are the needs and obviously also provide the necessary support that there is meaningful participation in institutions, but also planning processes and others. I'm not going to go into the detail of these other bits because this is also something we are developing. So if any of you are interested in knowing more or adding to this, please be in touch with me or Paul. And the monitoring bit is going to be covered by Bethany and Rick in the following session. Okay. I think one of the key bits to emphasize is that while we can talk of all of these at the global level, it's very important to consider the context in which these are going to be applied in or going to be planned in. There are social, cultural norms that are there. The various institutions are made of people who follow that. So we need to be mindful of these for the interventions to be relevant and appropriate, acceptable, also for these to be effective. And it's very important to ensure that in our interventions, we're not causing harm. And I think in our keynote, we will hear of an example that worked in a certain context but did not work in another. So different things work in different places. We need to be mindful and respectful of that. We need to change the needle, move the needle on certain norms which are not very helpful, but then we can engage with the system. It takes time and work on that. Just with respect to the flow of the session, we have Bethany from Emory and Rick who would be talking about how the JMP is looking at gender and WASH. We move on from there to our keynote speaker, Serene Malik, who would be talking more about the experiences from Africa and more specifically Kenya. And we move on from there to a more participatory session where we're going to be talking about the barriers, ranking those, and what are the possible strategies with respect to these that we should be taking up. And then we have the panel that will be moderated by Lisa with a very interesting group of people, and then we wrap up. We've been told to keep to time, so we're going to try to move, but also try to get your voices in. I request Bethany and Rick to come up.
Great. Thank you, everybody. It's nice to be here and to chat with you about gender and monitoring, and of course with Rick Johnston. We're going to be talking today about global progress on gender equity in WASH, focusing first on talking about global priority indicators for monitoring gender in WASH, and then diving specifically into the data. So, first, why do we need indicators? This might be obvious to many of you, but it's actually in the SDG agenda. for achieving gender equality across all of the SDGs. And the language around SDG 6 is about inclusivity. It's ensuring WASH for all. However, it's been dubbed gender blind by UN Women, or gender unaware, because none of the indicators, 6.1 and 6.2, currently collect sex disaggregated data. It's all household level. So to that end, we can't understand if there are differences or difference of experiences among individuals within those households. And when we don't have data, what we can see is that the same sort of inequities can persist, which Rick will talk about, but it also doesn't give us a roadmap to think about change or monitoring or assessing progress over time or identifying where there might be disparities in populations and in geographies. So, to that end, if you've seen this framework before, this is the WHO Gender Responsive Assessment Scale, and this is where the current SDG indicators sit. We, in the sort of blind or zone, closer to the harmful end of things, but we want to move them into a more sensitive and specific, and that's what this exercise of prioritization was aiming to do. So what we did is we set out to prioritize indicators, and this involved two phases. The first phase was more of an assessment or a review of what was out there, both in terms of the literature as well as the tools themselves. So what we first did is created a conceptual framework. Due to time, I'm not going to go into this framework, but I want to show you that it was there because we used this framework to then sort tools and survey items, existing indicators that people might have been using, just to create an inventory. We then realized there's actually quite a bit out there, and we need to really hone in and prioritize what we should measure. And we did this in a very systematic way, and we leveraged that framework. So here is one of the boxes of that framework, and underlined is time and labor. That's just one element. So what we did is for each element of the framework, for water, sanitation, and hygiene, we did an exercise where we looked at certain criteria to see if it should be monitored. So that included evidence and relevance, measurability, potential for change over time, comparability, and usefulness to practitioners and policymakers. So I showed time and labor because this is one of the ones that, for water specifically, but not for sanitation and hygiene, came out with high scores, which you can see in this figure above. So what we did is we did this for all of the dimensions of this framework for water, sanitation, and hygiene, but landed only at a few that were prioritized because we can't measure everything. No one has that kind of time or money. So this is where we landed. And then with those, we then identified potential measures and indicators for those themes alone. We then brought this process, we used the inventory we created, identified a long list of potential measures and indicators across those themes, and then brought that list to a group of experts who then reviewed it, helped us cull it down, shorten it down, and then put it open for public comment where we shortened it even more. And that's where we landed with this 15 indicator list of priority indicators. Again, this is not exhaustive. This is all only at sort of household domestic level, not schools, not healthcare facilities, and most of these are at individual level. So you can ask people in the household specifically about their experience, which allows us to get disaggregated data, but also intersectional data if that is collected as well. These are not meant to replace, but to complement any efforts that governments are doing nationally that are relevant to them. And it's also meant to complement what's already the 6.1 and 6.2 indicators. So here we are. I think we've successfully achieved getting some sensitive and specific indicators. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick to do.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Bethany. It was great having this collaboration with Emory because it allowed the JMP to, one, identify some specific data sources that were out there and some analyses that we could be making, and two, to have a framework to think, well, what are some areas maybe where there aren't data yet? And then when we came to our 2023 report, which had a thematic focus on gender, we could try and populate the different chapters of the report with as many data examples as we could find. And as Bethany mentioned, this area of time and labor spent around water in particular was both high priority and also relatively data rich, because household surveys have been collecting data on who's responsible for carrying water outside the home, separated by sex and age, for over 20 years. They've also been collecting data on the time spent per trip. And you can see, this is one of the figures from the 2023 report, that we found that globally, about 70% of households that collect water from off-premises, that work is done by women and girls. There's this, and about 1 in 6 households globally have to do that. So that's quite a big burden there. There's a similar distribution in sub-Saharan Africa and in Central and Southern Asia, though there's a higher proportion of the population that needs to collect water from off-premises in those regions. It's interesting to see that in Latin America and the Caribbean and Northern Africa and Western Asia, it's actually a very different distribution with more men responsible for collecting water, but much fewer households that actually have to collect water. I went back and looked at the JMP 2008 report and found almost an identical distribution of responsibility where, again, about 70% of households that have to collect water, it's done by women and girls. But in those 14 years, there's been a huge progress on bringing water closer to and into the home. So in 2022, it was 16% of households. In 2008, it was over 30% of households. So even in the face of population growth, that means that in 2022, there were 250 million fewer women and girls hauling water than in 2008. So that's just tremendous progress. I'm so happy about that. Another development that happened in 2017 was that the mix started asking an additional question about how many times that person had collected water. So it doesn't actually do you very much good to know how much one trip takes if you don't know how many trips are being taken. So with this new question, we could make an analysis about how much time is being spent and by who. And the graph on the right there shows on the right-hand side, the light blue figures, women and girls, and on the left, men and boys. And it's very clear that especially in countries like Malawi, where nearly an hour is spent per day on average collecting water, the burden is disproportionately felt by women. And to some extent by girls. You can see up the top there some countries like Dominican Republic, Tunisia. There's a very small burden, and that's borne more by men. Turning to sanitation, we noted that the existing SDG indicator of basic sanitation service that's not shared has a gender dimension because when people have to use shared, limited sanitation services, it puts them at risk of injury, of harassment, of sexual violence, and that's disproportionately felt by women. We also made an analysis of a smaller set of surveys where men and women who use shared sanitation in urban contexts were asked, how safe do you feel walking outside your home at night? And surprise, surprise, men feel a lot safer walking outside their home at night in these contexts of shared sanitation than do women. So in Belarus, it was men were 4 times as likely to feel safe or very safe when walking outside the home. I just want to turn for a second to schools. In June, the JMP launched its new report on Washington schools, and it had a special focus on menstrual hygiene, menstrual health. And we drew upon another framework, another review of core indicators conducted by the Global MHH Monitoring Group. And that recommended a set of core indicators, and we really structured the report around those indicators to, again, find where there were examples of data we could draw upon. We found big data gaps, but 30 countries that had some kind of national data, and enough data to say that globally only about 2 in 5 schools provide menstrual health education, and that only about 1 in 3 schools have provision for management of used menstrual products in toilets, so bins for sanitary and discrete disposal. And that includes high-income countries as well as low-income countries. We have to recognize that this is not just a problem of low and middle-income countries. So to wrap up with some key messages, I would say that we're excited about filling data gaps. Having these reviews helps us to identify areas that need more data collection, but also to have opportunities for data collection. So if a country or an NGO or anyone is doing a survey and says, we'd like to know more about the gender burden of this or that, we can say, well, we have a list of priority recommended indicators. Here are some measures, some of which have been validated, some of which need further validation. The new Mix 7 module includes a number of these, so that's an opportunity. But again, there are a lot of countries where Mix aren't used, so we have bigger data gaps in those, but less clear pathways to fill those gaps. And Bethany?
Sure. And so the last point is really just that from the research side, there's some of those measures that need more work and validation. So we invite people to do some of that work alongside us, pilot them, see how they work in different contexts, and make sure that they are able to capture what we want them to capture and be comparable over space and time. And report your data. Some people collect it and then just decide not to report it. So that's all from us, and thank you so much.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name's Paul Hutchins. I'll introduce myself after the next speaker. My job now and my pleasure is to introduce Serene Malik, who's going to give us a keynote. Serene is a lawyer by training and one of the sector's kind of real top advocates and coordinators. She's the chair of the African Civil Society Network for Water and Sanitation and also the vice chair of the Sanitation and Water for All Steering Committee. And she's going to kind of take us from the world of monitoring and research into actually how do we drive change in these types of systems and how can we advocate for that type of change. So I'd like to invite Serene up.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning to all of you. I think to add on to the data that was presented by Bethany and John, UNICEF 2023 report, 200 million hours, I believe, that were spent in the Global South by women in collecting water, which translated to 8.3 or 8.5 million days, which translated to 22,000 years, which is the Stone Age. So it's literally women waking up in the Stone Age and having less than 24 hours to catch up to the 21st century. So I think that's just really the problem. Now, for those that know me, any platform that I have really is in terms of we must address this situation. We must do something. All resources need to be pretty much fielded towards ensuring that half of the population within the Global South is actually given an opportunity to wake up in the 21st century and try and make it to the 22nd century. Most recently in Kenya, as you are aware, we were pursuing the sextortion case where we had found actually gender-based violence with women. It took us a whole 8 years to do it. But we managed to get the law through in February, March, and it happened within 72 hours. Why? Because of the visual and the data that had been given to the lawmakers and the policymakers. But it pretty much boiled down to telling them that these women, after enduring what they have to try and fetch water and collect water, it didn't stop there. The abuse didn't stop there. It was that they had to drink their abuse, they had to wash themselves with their abuse, they had to feed their children with that abuse, they had to clean their clothes with that abuse, and that really struck a chord in terms of, that, gosh, we actually needed to do something. But this was also the example how powerful the water sector is as a vector to transform, actually, society. Because while the sextortion law was completely removed from the water sector at that point and taken to the penal code, it actually impacted and profoundly every other sector in the country. And this brings me to my point. What is done for women in the water sector will have a profound effect for everything and everyone within the sector moving forward. What they did is that they took the penal code, they created what is called an omnibus act, and then went and inserted that very clause in every other statute in the country, whether it was education, whether it was health, whether it was employment, you name it, it was actually put in there. And this was really as a result of work that was done within the water sector. Now, why the water sector? And this is really a question that is being asked because water is deeply embedded in all the other development agendas. There is something about a mother and the kind of water she gives to drink to her child. It starts from there, so it's really a visceral thing. And I think moving forward, that is probably why we need to equally advocate for, and which we are doing, the visibility of the water sector, but also in terms of addressing water and women, because we have the evidence that it can actually change society in the most extraordinary way. This was done now without the water sector players. And that is the other thing in terms of this system thinking. More often than not, some of the criticism that we have is that we're in a bit of our own bubble. You know, we like just within ourselves, Ministry of Water, sometimes local government, but there were other players that were involved in actually pushing for a change in the system. In this case, of course, it was the Supreme Audit institutions that had to get involved. People like drafters, the Attorney General's office, the Deputy Speaker's office, law reform commissions that needed to come on board. In fact, in that meeting, we were only 2 people from the water sector. And at that point, it was like, give us your data. Has it been validated? We accept it. The government has accepted it. Let's move it forward. There was also some political elements over there and political pressure as well that helped us along the way. The second thing, and this is what I saw in terms of elections and ensuring that women actually have a seat at the table, there's something that we've been discussing quite a bit, which is the zebra approach. This is in terms of man, woman, which whatever constituency you have, the representation has to be proportional. And it is not optional, that this is the way it has to be done. People with disabilities, if it's 25%, women, if it is 50, 60%, men. So just really ensuring that they are represented and those seats are available for these people. Because we have seen that if you leave it up to elections, or if you leave it up to a choice, it doesn't quite work out. I mean, let's be frank. And we feel that that would also change to a certain extent how politics are actually played in our countries. Kenya, for example, is moving towards this type of constituency system. In terms of one constituency, what is the population of women, what is the population of men, how many people with disabilities, and any kind of mechanism that allows for participation, we have to make sure that these seats are covered adequately. On the continental front and on the regional front, I'll stop lamenting about the situation of women. Let's talk a bit more in terms of what is going on and what we've done. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, we launched at the continental level the Youth and the Gender Strategy. So this is being supported by the Republic of South Africa, which was fantastic that they actually put their weight behind this policy document. And this is something that the continent has agreed on and has been already signed by the member states and accepted that this is the strategy that we're going to use. Now, on the continent, it is only 10 countries that have a gender-responsive WASH type of policy. And in most cases, it is just at policy level. So it has not been translated into an administrative recommendation, it has not been translated into legislation, and it has not been translated into any type of ministerial decree. And there lies really our work in terms of ensuring how do we make this a reality on the ground. So that has been a huge, huge deal. It's unfortunate that not more people are aware of it, but this is something that I really urge all of you to come and support. It is an open process. Feel free to go to the AMCA website. You will find it, register for the Partnership Coordination Platform, thematic group number 8, which is the gender group. Because really we're going to need all hands on deck, really, to make this a reality. The other issue as well in terms of why, because we ask why aren't women important? Please explain it to us. There's an orientation issue. Now, recently we did a vox pop, just asking people. So we said, ask the men whether they received water this morning, if they got water. All of them answered yes. And when we asked them, are you the one to have gotten that water? All of them answered no. And so we say, there was a development partner that was complaining, Serene, they don't pay attention. I said, it is normal the local authorities will not pay attention. It's his mother and sister that used to fetch water for him, not him. And that is also where the change actually needs to take place. There are other issues, but I can see Paul telling me to finish up. But things are improving. It's good to see even the data here that has been shown, but we need to do better as we move along and make sure that these women are actually given a chance at life generally. Thank you.
I'm sorry for interrupting her. I could listen to Serene all day, and that was really powerful. Thank you. So just to introduce myself, my name's Paul Hutchins. I'm an associate professor at the University of Leeds, and I'm part of the research and learning team for the WASH Systems for Health program, which is the FCDO program, which is delivering system strengthening initiatives in 6 countries across South Asia, East Africa, and West Africa. So my job, and quite a difficult job in this room, is to help bring something a bit more participatory to the session and try to get you guys thinking about these issues of systems, system-based approaches, system strengthening, and gender equity. Often when we're thinking about gender inequity, we're thinking about the service outcomes and the ongoing impacts on health. And that's what we have to keep in the forefront of our mind. But actually, we know the bottlenecks are higher up. They're upstream from that. They're in the systemic systems that produce those outcomes. And part of the mandate for the research and learning within the WASH Systems for Health program is to help curate some research and knowledge product development in this space. And we're just about to start working on it, and we're really keen to engage partners throughout the initiative. So what we're going to do in this part of the session is really think about what the most intractable or difficult barriers, system-based barriers are around gender equity. I'm going to be facilitating on stage. For those online, welcome to all our online participants. Our colleagues Lauren in Brighton, England, and Shiny in Delhi, India, will be helping with the discussions. We're going to be using a platform called VVox, which is a bit like Mentimeter, but you have to apologize. The University of Leeds changed our licenses last year, and we now go with these guys. And we also will be doing some small group discussion. And we're not in the best room, so it's really steep, so I don't want people moving around and getting hurt, but hopefully you can engage with people you're sitting with, or you can turn around groups of pairs, 3s and 4s. So what are we going to do over the next 20 minutes or so? I'm going to run through, after this slide, some typical system-based barriers to gender equity. And then I'm going to give you 10 minutes to talk about them in your small groups, and then come to a ranking of what is the most difficult barrier to address in your view. Okay? This is often, Ruchika said context is queen, not king, in this session. And context matters, but we're going to be doing this in a bit of a generic way, but hopefully you can get into it. We're then going to put up the VVox votes, and we will see what the most difficult barriers are, and then we will have, we will hopefully open it up and allow people to suggest ways to address one or two of the most difficult barriers. And we will again be capturing some ideas on VVox, but we hope we can rove a mic around as well. So, to give us a bit of structure here, we came up with some typical barriers that we might address or issues we might address through kind of system-based interventions or system strengthening interventions. We boxed it in a little bit to rural sanitation just to give us a little bit of a kind of sectoral context, because sometimes when we talk about WASH generally, it really does not make sense. And these are some of the kind of typical barriers that we want you to talk about. We often hear, we've already heard about the issues around a lack of female representation, sometimes being a system-based barrier to gender equity, definitely for those higher level things of gender transformation when we're thinking about changing power relations. That's a really key thing. We know that there can be financial barriers. Finance is a barrier for almost all our goals. That can be within the institutional systems, within the government systems, preventing us and those with the mandate to provide services, providing gender-sensitive services, particularly in schools, not having gender-specific and appropriate, dignified systems. But we know finance, when we look at it with a gendered lens, is a massive barrier at the household level, particularly in contexts where women are do not have autonomy or decision-making power over much of the family expenditure. Safety and security around infrastructure is a key thing. Where do we site infrastructure? How is it constructed? That can expose people to safety and insecurity issues. And we've got 4 more, so we can have a lack of awareness within governments, sometimes, frankly, a disrespect for the issue. So there can be issues around inadequate training. Stockholm, I love it as a researcher, weak monitoring, we don't disaggregate our data, we don't know what's going on, that's another kind of system-based barrier. And then finally, we have really good policy, and it's actually in the policy implementation, but sometimes the policy cannot give that kind of top-down mandate for addressing these issues. And then there's one that kind of pervades everything here, cultural norms and taboos, and that can affect, the whole lot, but we put it here as a kind of policy or governance issue. So what I want you to be doing, and you're going to have about 10 minutes to do this, is to talk in your small groups. We're going to leave this slide up. In about 5 minutes, we will flip to the VVox page, and we will start seeing the voting. But for now, just concentrate on the discussion, and really there's a lot there. You'll do well to get through them, but really think about what are the most difficult barriers out of these to address if you were thinking about it as a program officer working in a WASH government office or NGO with a mandate to improve gender equity through a system strengthening approach. So, okay, so you're going to have 10 minutes. Get on with it, please.
You take this and you
Okay, folks, you've got 5 minutes left, and we've put the VBox up so you can start seeing things come in. And I'll give you a 1 minute warning at the end, but do try and get your votes in, please. Okay, we're going to have 1 more minute discussion, and actually, in the spirit of dynamic facilitation, I'm going to ask some groups or some representatives to talk to some of these barriers and just hear people's thoughts about why they were ranked where they were. Okay, so you've got 1 minute to round off and get any final votes in. Okay, thank you everyone. So I want to, if I can ask for your attention again, please, and we will kind of unpack these together. I will talk us through it very briefly, and then what I want to do is then maybe go around and see whether there's any brave volunteers to speak to some of these issues about why they think it's either a very difficult or a proportionally less difficult barrier, and maybe any ideas on how we're going to respond to it, because as always we over-programmed, but we're going to slightly adapt. So yeah, I mean, I think we're not surprised here that the top barrier, almost it's tautological because it's deeply ingrained beliefs, social norms. We know from centuries of work, and we know just intuitively as humans that changing social norms and deep held cultures is very, very difficult. Are we in a position as a WASH sector to completely address patriarchy and all these widespread norms? It's hard, but I think Serene's talk and actually how we can be a powerful route to addressing it was really inspiring. Yeah, some of the other ones are coming up. Female representation. I think I can imagine people talking to this that quotas are easy, but genuine power is the difficult bit, right? But yeah, that's also really interesting. We see, I think it's off the screen, monitoring and policy are the ones that are deemed maybe proportionally less difficult. I still think to get right, as we've heard earlier, it can be hard. Rick's like, no. Yeah, we all know Rick's got a really easy job. That's the thing, isn't it? So, right. So what I want to do now, we've got about 10 minutes till we get to the panel. I'd love to hear the thoughts of some of the people in the room who maybe either want to pick one of these barriers and talk about why they think it is a difficult one to address or a less difficult one. And any ideas, you can talk to that, and if you can help us solve it, or, some thoughts on that as well. So is there going to be anyone? Oh, we've got our first volunteer. We do have to stand slightly awkwardly as we get the mics to you in this room, so apologies, but yeah. Well positioned, right in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Martina. I'm with WaterAid. So I'm very voted for the cultural norms and taboos, but I'm not also quite happy with the framing of that.
Yeah, please.
Because I think it's more than cultural norms and taboos. These are gender norms and stereotypes that run through all of the cultures in all of our countries across the entire world. We've got these gender norms, and these are, I think, they're not only limiting discussions and actions around the women's needs, it's limiting all of these other ones, right? This is why we're not having women in leadership position. Because of them, we don't have, proper investments in the right infrastructure. But I think also, as WASH actors, we can't be ignoring those facts. We can't say, no, it's too hard. We can't do that. Because it doesn't really matter if we get water into people's homes, because if it's still going to be that woman's responsibility to work with that water, to do the cleaning, to manage the sanitation, to handle, the water operators, to clean the sanitation, whatever it is. She's still going to be bound to that house and to those household chores and that unpaid care and domestic work. So, and that's not going to get her out, opening up her own business just because we got water to her house. We need to also be addressing those norms that is keeping her, that is holding her back. So I think we as WASH actors, we can't stop at getting water to her house. We need to take that responsibility of actually, having those conversations. And I think those conversations will have to happen all the way through all of these barriers on system level and on community and household level.
Thank you.
So that's good.
Very powerfully put. I'm not going to try and add to it, but do we have someone else that that would like to talk to one of the barriers at the top? We've got someone. Oh, good run in. Yeah, stay safe, please.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This is Jess MacArthur from a variety of organizations. I think maybe just to say, that's the easiest way to say that. I think we also struggled with this list, and probably because I struggled with this list, my team had to listen to my struggles with this list.
Yep.
Yeah, but it's fantastic to see it written down. I think sanitation has historically been an engineering or an economics or a health situation. And it is all of those things, and we've talked a lot about co-benefits at this conference, which is fantastic. And I think we don't see gender as an entry point or gender equality and social inclusion. I'm gonna add more than the gender equity, it's equity more broadly.
Yep.
We don't see that as an entry point to better sanitation, and that better sanitation can be an entry point to better gender equality and social inclusion in communities as well. So this kind of symbiotic co-benefit relationship between these two places. And it starts with the fact that most of the people we work with are men, which is totally fine. But how do we, as we heard earlier from Serene, men are the ones who drink the water, but women are the ones who often collect it. And so it happens the same in sanitation. Men are the ones who decide where the toilets go. Women are the ones who are using those toilets in really complicated places. So yeah, that's just one tiny example. Anything else, team? Okay.
Thanks, that was great. Have we got, there's two more questions here. I think we'll comments. We'll take one at the top and then the gentleman in the sharp waistcoat, his conference out attire that I often see him in, so nice. And then we will move to the panel because I can't eat up too much of the panel time. So there's these two comments and then we will move on. There's one at the top. Sorry, yeah. And apologies if I haven't seen you. There's blind spots with the lights, so if you've had your hands up anywhere here.
Thank you. I'm Linga Mihoa from Malawi. We had a very good discussion in our group. I think it was around the social norms and also the financial muscle for women. I think those have come up. But I wanted to speak to the issue around the number 2, the lack of female representation. The way it's put out, I think we are also shooting ourselves in the foot, because when we look at WASH, there are a lot of women that are in that sector. And I think just given the example that she teased out, who's collected the water, who's made a decision around the water in the household or even at household level. So the more we look at governance from a formal perspective, I think it does take out the role that women make, because even when the woman is going to collect the water and she's deciding on how it's used, that's a form of governance at informal level. So we need to be careful around perpetuating the narrative that there's lack of women's representation and acknowledge that women are in the governance of water. It's just that we happen to underplay the role that women make in the governance of water, because we cannot be talking about 99% of the WASH-related roles being done by women, and yet we are saying they're not in the governance. So let's be very careful around the narrative.
Thank you. And then I think, we've got a final comment, and apologies if you've not been able to input, but Sean.
Yes, so I have a question. So Sean Fury from SCAT Foundation, IWSN. We're framing, I agree that cultural norms and taboos is by far the number one and most difficult thing to shift. So my question to people who are way more informed than me is that so far I generally hear that it's framed in terms of the dynamics between men and women. I wonder what the role of the matriarchy is in terms of older women in enforcing cultural norms on younger women, and how that plays out in something like rural sanitation.
Thank you. So we're not going to be able to round them off, but we've had some really thoughtful points that I think actually will be nicely picked up in the panel. We actually, on the next, I will switch the VVox for a final thing. We won't talk about it, but it's an open box entry where people can talk about the types of solutions or issues they're interested in. As said, we are very much learning. There is a lot of expertise in this room, but we are working as the research and learning partner on the WASH Systems for Health program. One of the priority areas is gender equity and social inclusion, but particularly thinking about it from this systems lens. And so we're really keen to engage with all the great work that's going on and over the next 4 years of the program. Right, I've seen finish, I'm being told. So I'm going to pass over to a panel. Lisa Rudge is the WASH advisor at FCDO and the officer for this whole program. So Lisa, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Rudge. I am a WASH advisor at the FCDO, and I have the honor today of moderating this amazing panel. I am shortly going to invite them all up here. I think this has been really interesting so far. We've really covered quite a lot. We've covered kind of rights. We haven't spoken so much about Indigenous rights, but maybe that will come up in this session. We've also spoken about how valuable data is to help us kind of identify where we need to be doing more, and there really is more that we need to do. So on that, I'm not going to speak for very long because I have a very distinguished panel today. So I'm going to invite up Nancy Eslick, who is the Global Water Coordinator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Welcome, Nancy. I am also going to invite up Julita Chinziu, who is the WASH Business Coordinator at Water for People in Malawi. Welcome. Next, I'm going to invite Parto Hafaz Sheikh, who's the Director of Program and Policy at WaterAid Bangladesh. Welcome, thank you for joining. Next, I'm going to invite Bethlehem Mengistu, who's the Global Coordinator for Agenda for Change. Welcome. And finally, you've already met Bethany Caruso, who's Assistant Professor at Emory University. Welcome again. Wonderful. So our panel, we're going to look today at how can we be purposeful in our policy and programs, and how can we address those real-world challenges and take the opportunities to further gender equity and social inclusion in a systemic way. So I'll turn to Nancy first. We're so delighted to have you here with us today, Nancy. I think you've had a busy week. My first question to you is, from your leadership role in the sector, including your work overseas, what are your reflections on empowering women as leaders, including from Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities, and what can leaders do to empower them?
Thanks so much for the question, Lisa. I really appreciate it. And I was excited especially to talk about Indigenous peoples. USAID overall, we have been undergoing a localization effort on really how to move from discussion to action and move our funding where we want it to be, which is with local partners, with governments, with regional institutions. We've made great efforts on this. We are still doing more on these efforts. I was really struck by the opening presentation today on the apples, the giving tree, redone on equity. And I think it really speaks volumes on removing some of the barriers to get to equity. And so it's somewhere in between kind of this conversation and the list that we just did on the survey. And I will take, in Cambodia, I was mission director there, and we worked a lot with Indigenous peoples. But I'll say a lot of that work was internal to my own organization. It was about changing our own systems and processes because we are not user-friendly. Not that anyone in this room would say that USAID is difficult to work with, but we have a few rules and regulations. But in Cambodia, more than 10% of the population is an ethnic minority or an Indigenous people. But how do we interact with folks? I took on a role of learning and listening as a leader, and that was also listening to my implementing partners on the challenges and hurdles they had. We made some great strides, and part of that was, how do we put funds and decision-making into the hands of Indigenous peoples, including women? But we can't talk about women in leadership until we talk about Indigenous peoples. And so, I really give a lot of credit to one of our implementing partners. They spent time to redo their grant process and take away the bulk of the burden away from writing in local language, writing in English, and opening up formal bank accounts and the registration process with local communities so that indigenous groups could receive money and actually make decisions themselves. But what did that take? That took me changing as a leader. It took USAID changing as a leader and accepting that our implementing partners needed to make changes. I think in that, the other thing I'd just like to say that I'm really proud that USAID is working on is globally we're looking at how we solicit applications to include other groups. Maybe, especially in Latin America, a local organization, English isn't their first language to write a proposal. So we're looking really hard at how we can solicit, especially concepts and others in local language, do that review, get that feedback in whether that's French, Spanish, Arabic, to break down some of those barriers. So all of those are kind of the precursors to also making sure that women have an opportunity, is creating that equity, going back to that amazing graphic on how we level the playing field. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Nancy. That's really important, I think, about creating the space, right, as well for this to happen and for those social norms to change and for leaders to emerge. So thank you for those really important points. I'm going to turn now to Malawi, and I'm going to ask Julita to tell us a little bit about the work of Water for People in Malawi, where integrating gender equity into wash systems. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's led to significant impact, the work on wash systems? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for having me here. And from the results of the survey, I think we've all seen where Malawi stands, one of the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa with a population of 20 million. But when we talk of access, we are very behind. In terms of water, we are at 88%, and this is just basic service. And in terms of sanitation, we're at 35%. We are still way behind. But despite that, there is progress that has been made significantly. And let me start by saying that for the first time in Malawi, a ministry of WASH independently has been set up. So that's already a plus. And in addition to that, that minister is a lady. That's progress on its own. But then, in terms of the examples of progress that we have done in including issues around gender equity and social inclusion, I would look at the work that was done by Water for People in moving issues around MHM, menstrual hygiene management, in public institutions, from just a general practice whereby practitioners would just come in and feel like, okay, I just want to construct a latrine here which is going to help learners as they go to school, to now include wash facilities in which MHM is a factor. So for every construction of wash facilities in public institutions in Malawi right now, it is a must, and this has been embedded in the policy, that should include an MHM facility. That is a step ahead from just generally constructing a latrine here and there, constructing a hand washing station here and there, to a step whereby now every implementing partner knows that if we are to help improve washing facilities, we should know that MHM facility is a must. Secondly, I have another example which has also made a good progress in terms of gender equity and inclusion, which is to do with the removal of tax for menstrual pads. That is, you know, right? Okay, so this was led by a network of all the WASH implementers, and being a part and parcel of that was Water for People as one of the organizations. We had Self-Help Africa, then United Purpose, we had WaterAid, among other key players, including a local radio station which is called Tinven, in Chichewa. In English, that means hear us out, for the youth. These came together and lobbied for the removal of this tax on sanitary pads. It started with engaging the parliament committees. It started with meeting the minister herself. And that was a good progress, and even meeting the financial minister as well. So that made it a success, and in 2023, this was made into a bill, and now it's just pending operationalization. That is a plus for the Malawi country. But then, we also have a favorable condition now as we are implementing the FCDO program, because it has come at a time whereby several policies in WASH are due for review. So this gives us a good opportunity whereby issues to do with gender equity and inclusion are a priority. So that first of all, we don't just look at it on the ground, how is it working, but now up there at policy level, how best can we unpack it, how best can we define it, and even addressing the issues of social norms that have just been identified. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you. Excellent. I can see the panelists have been so well briefed. They're all keeping to time. So thank you very much. This is very exciting. And I think so important to understand how our policy actually goes into practice and to have those examples of what works. Sometimes it can be so frustrating to be working on policies and policies and policies. And then, but it's so great to hear when that actually takes place. So I am now going to turn over to Bethlehem. Sorry, I hope I didn't change the order too much, but Bethlehem, just because I think it's useful as well to go back a little bit to that broader piece on kind of intersecting identities, I think. So intersecting identities such as gender, race, class, and disability influence access and control over WASH resources. So what are effective strategies to address these complexities in a WASH system strengthening effort? And I think you're well placed as the coordinator to answer that.
Thanks. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. It's a great question, and it's a question that bears attention and prioritization. So when looking at intersectionality, intersection identities affect an individual's experience and can have a decisive impact whether a person or a group is experiencing discrimination or marginalization. And it's very important for us as WASH actors to understand this issue, because this is how we understand who is the hard to reach and who is left behind, essentially. And those two key things are very key, given the fact that we've collectively committed to universal access around reaching everyone, everywhere. And this issue is relevant not just to the WASH sector, but everywhere, because it's about equality and ensuring the indivisibility of access to rights. What this requires of us as WASH system strengthening actors is being intentional around understanding the one and everyone. That's essentially what it's about, and being able to allocate resources and also the expertise to analyze and understand intersecting identities. Because the world is diverse, communities are diverse, so services should actually be responsive to that. And it's through the analysis and understanding of intersecting identities that we're able to mitigate barriers that people face with regards to accessing their right to water, sanitation, and hygiene. For example, a woman living in a rural area from an ethnic minority who may be living with a disability is not going to be able to realize her access to WASH easily. She'll face physical barriers, social barriers, so being able to factor that into the services that we invest in is quite critical, because when we build services with just the average person in mind, and average person, I would say able-bodied young male, that means our investment is actually exclusionary rather than inclusive. So being able to also bring in the do no harm that Rishika was talking about is very key. The other key aspect is around the voice and the agency when looking at kind of intersecting identities. And I would say, this around kind of decision-making of WASH resources is even a wider gap. It's even a wider gap because it's usually the case that the realities of those with intersecting identities is less known and less understood and less documented. So when we do engage in the delivery of services, delivery of WASH systems, these voices are absent from design processes or financing processes or budgeting processes. So the analysis, the understanding, the documenting of lived stories, and integrating those qualitative aspects into implementation, monitoring, et cetera, is quite key. And this can change, it can change. We can realize the desired narrative where we're able to contribute and accelerate everyone everywhere and universal access, but requires intentionality. It requires resourcing. It requires making sure that we have expertise in this area across our various organizations, and it's not brought in as a last-minute add-on, as we saw in the various presentations. So perhaps the first thing is to strengthen our own willingness and capacity. You know, I work I coordinate Agenda for Change, which champions collaboration. But it's so easy to say that collaboration is important, but doing it is really difficult. So the distinction there is not just being the collective of the willing, but to be the collective of practitioners with action. So that's something I think from our end that we can do better. And another key aspect, which is a missed opportunity, is having meaningful partnerships with organizations that have expertise in these areas. Women's rights organizations, organizations working on people with disabilities. Someone said, I think it was Serene, that the WASH sector is quite insular. We have a bit of a bubble, and I think it's important to realize that there's actually no sector called the WASH sector. We created that sector. It's water, it's sanitation, and it's hygiene. And sanitation actually belongs to health, it belongs to education. So it's creating that bubble and that insular space may rob us of the opportunity to learn from others who have been doing this so well for so many years. So facilitating that space to have that meaningful partnership with rights organizations and others. And also leading by example, it would be useful to be able to convey the desirable narrative from within our own organizational practices around living to DAI values. Living to and showing through kind of, from the front around enabling diversity, enabling equity and inclusion within our own systems, our own organizations, around our governance and leadership structures, because the community is diverse, and if we don't present the change that we want to see, then, it's credibility around going to governments and going to communities. So, us leading by example. There's a lot of progress. The data is amazing. There's recognition for this now that we're in the SDGs, but still there's a bit to go. So those will be some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Bethlehem. Yeah, absolutely agree. I think we do need to lead by example, and we definitely need to look at the data to find out as well where some of those challenges are and then how to address them. I am going to turn to our brave male panelist today, to Partho. And I'm really excited to have you over from Bangladesh. And so I'm going to ask you if you could share some insights from your work in Bangladesh, in particular how, in addressing some of the gender roles and dynamics in your program and advocacy work. So I know you've got plenty to say, so over to you, Partho.
Thank you for having me. I think, the way that this session started off with, understanding the roles, understanding the gender norms within the society, but then, as you understand, if you really want to change the system, you really need to understand this. And Rick was presenting a lot of data. We also currently, have done a gender assessment of one of our programs, and that where we basically found a bit more than what he has in terms of percentages. About 87% in households, basically women are responsible for chores and bringing in water. So I think it was 69 there. But interestingly, the information that probably was not there is that men control, decision making. And that's about 75%, that decisions of around water, around what needs to be done is basically controlled by men, particularly on water resources. So understanding that, that there is a gender inequality there, we tried to address this in I'll give you a couple of examples of how in various forms we have tried to, address this. We have an approach, what we call water entrepreneurship for women empowerment, where we take in 5 women, and support them to build their capacity to run a water business, in RO. So basically, that's a non-traditional role, women going into business, particularly into a water business and all that. So that is something that, we have done. And that has really led to one of the leaders of this one RO plant being part of the local government institution, what we call union porishad. That's the highest, that's the lowest level of local government. So basically, from a empowerment point of view, she was doing a business, but leveraging that business, leveraging that social status that she attained, she was able to be represented in a local government institute. So that kind of, and then what it did is basically it's raised the voice of women there. And at least to some extent, not saying that it solves the problem, but it's a good start. That's how we basically see it. So the other thing is, even she is there, but what about how we do the policies, how we know exactly what the problems are within that society, within that union porishad, within those 9 words that the union has. So we have a process, what we call participatory ward vulnerability assessments, where we get the women, the adolescent girls, even the men, including the local government institutions, representative there, and try to find out, what the issues are around, water, sanitation, hygiene, how it is being impacted by climate change. And when they make that plan, that is incorporated into the budgets and the plans of the union porishad. So that's how we are trying to, not only raise the voice, but, trying to implement things that can be done by the local government institutions. So in one sense, we have seen that, there are issues around representation, there are issues around norms, which in various shapes and forms, we definitely try to, address. We have also tried to get the female ward councillors from municipalities together and, talk about their issues, talk about their problems, because these are, these are the women who are taking on sanitation challenges within their communities. So, trying to learn from them, working with the Bangladesh, Association for Municipalities, Municipal Association of Bangladesh, what we call MAB, so that, taking it to them. So their knowledge, their understanding, their issues can be placed at a very high level in terms of the whole municipal association. Lastly, but not least, with the support of what's System Strengthening for Health projects, we have worked with the government, and we have influenced them because to develop 2 guidelines. So basically, let me read it from my paper so that I don't get it wrong. Gender mainstreaming guideline for planning, implementation, and monitoring of WASH intervention. So monitoring, I think Paul would be very happy. He would be very happy about it. So basically looking into that. The other one is basically looking for guidelines for private sector participation in WASH, where definitely when we talk about these 5 women, they are the private sectors. So this is how basically, we are trying to address the various issues are there. And again, as Ruchika has presented, that there are multiple, issues around caste, creed, religion, but, just focusing on gender, there are many things that we can talk about, and these are some of the examples from Bangladesh that we can give you that we are trying to address our, as a solution to the various issues around gender. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Parto. That was really useful, and we know that a lot of the change is going to happen at the local level, right? So it's so important to understand what those drivers of change can be. And just on the point about women in the workforce as well, and maybe just my personal experience, I worked as a supervisor on waterworks. There were 2 women in an office of, 30 people. Yeah, I won't tell you how many years ago that was, but, things are changing, but are they changing fast enough? And I think we all have to champion that. Well, not finally, but next I'm going to go over to Bethany. So we've heard quite a lot, right, from what's happening, but there's still some research gaps. Right, so we heard a little bit about that initially, but can you give us some more insights into kind of what some of those research gaps are, and any new insights into those kind of gender disparities in WASH?
Absolutely, thank you. And really great tee up for some of the comments that were provided previously. So research is a system in and of itself, which comes with its own gender biases. And I think much like Nancy talked about in the beginning, there's a real need for reflection on how we're doing the work, and that's a big gap. So to talk about that a little, I want to just mention a review that my team did of 33 intervention studies. We wanted to know who was being targeted to carry out the research, who was answering the surveys, who's being targeted to perform the interventions that were being executed, treating the water, attending health promotion things. For both, women were the most sought after group for doing the research activities and for performing the programmatic activities. Sometimes time burden was talked about as why these would fail, but it was very rare that any of these assessed how much time participation in research or programming took women. Far fewer compensated them. So what does this mean? It means that, we've seen with Rick's slide, perpetuating the fact that women are continuously the same proportion carrying out unpaid labor. It doesn't mean they're not a part of the government. It actually means that they're hyper-competent. They're hyper-competent, so we're seeking them out to do the research and to do the program. But we're strengthening in research, in our activities, and in the programming, this norm that they are unpaid for that. And as soon as those positions become available to be paid and professionalized, they are no longer competent for those positions. So this is how it gets into the workplace. So that means that we need to, in my research, who's in my group? Who's in my room? Are they there? Are they talking? Are we hearing them? Are they influencing? Are they leading? It is not enough that they're just there. So they have to get up. They have to be paid. They have to be compensated for it. And we need to start thinking. And I want our research communities to start thinking way more deliberately about how we're doing that research. And that even extends to these conferences. You know, I walked in yesterday with my kids because my husband and I were both presenting in the same session. They're not in school yet. I can't wait till they get back. But I was told very firmly that this conference has a history of a no-child policy. That type of policy, many have them, many conferences. Many different things like that are policies that don't need to be there, but they're on the harmful side. So what we need to do is think about, to mirror also what Jess was saying, WASH is important for gender equality, but it's a vehicle for it. We need to stop thinking about WASH programs as just the end, but WASH programs as a facilitator to get to gender equality. And research has a huge portion to play in that, and not only discovering disparities of who has water and who doesn't, but how we're leaning into them for our own gains.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Yeah, really important points. Thanks for making them. Our policies and the way they're implemented is so important, right? So just back to my own little story, you know, they had to build a separate shower and toilet when the two of us joined this men's team. It was quite funny. It did get done eventually after a few months, but that enabled us to work there. So thanks as well for your contributions. So I'm going to turn to Nancy again a little bit. So we've heard quite a lot about how this works in Malawi and Bangladesh on the ground. And obviously USAID is quite a big funder of WASH programs across the world. So can you tell us a little bit more about how gender equity and social inclusion are addressed within USAID's global water portfolio?
Sure. Thanks so much. And I really have appreciated the comments of all the fellow panelists. There are things I'm going to really take back and think about. But you know, inside the U.S. Global Water Strategy, we have 4 broad objectives. Looking at sector governance, finance, institution and markets, WASH access, freshwater management, and reducing water-related conflict and fragility. So if we look at the strategy component, we have a global strategy. We roll that down into 22 high-priority countries. That is then hopefully rolled down into individual project and program designs. We've monitored that through all the great, hopefully, non-gender additional work collected, research to make sure our programs are doing well. But I think there's a part that I want to talk about, which is what do we use with that data and research? What's the end all of that data and research. And I think it's to inform policymakers. But again, push all of us in this room to think about, when is the last time the person directly above you, and maybe some of you only work within a WASH group, made WASH a priority in a meeting, talked about it, or the head of your organization talked about WASH on a global level. It's not a WASH meeting or conference. I was really proud for the US that we recently had, and WASH is part of the G20 agenda. But what I'm saying is, it's important that we all influence our own individual leaders so that WASH is integrated across issues. The example from Jordan, we did, and your story really resonated with me, Lisa, we did gender audits of all the ministries. Great, we did gender audits, but what did we do with that? So I worked really hard to get those gender points in the talking points of the ambassador whenever she met with the minister. Oh, I noticed on your mid-level managers, only 1% are women. What are you doing about that? You know, when the US ambassador asked that question, and then all the ministers, everybody has an office meeting, right? Then one minister's like, oh my God, the ambassador asked me about this. And somebody else is like, oh, she asked me too. So then everybody started getting ready for that question. And I can say, 5-6 years later, we're seeing changes in the upper level leadership of Jordanian ministries, especially the Ministry of Water, which was one of the worst. Or maybe there were women in the HR section. So I think it's also behooves all of us to elevate WASH in our own organizations, elevate it with our leaders, and then finally look at the intersection of WASH with other programs so that WASH is not the end-all be-all. In India, we've done some great programming that's not necessarily WASH programming, it's livelihoods programming that intersects with gender, transgender, WASH, but also really livelihoods, looking about how we can train individuals from marginalized groups to become water operators. And as soon as they became part of the formalized economy, it gave them access to all sorts of government benefits that they did not have before. And then they became empowered. I loved your comments about women in business. Women want to buy menstrual products from other women. How are we incorporating them into the formal business sector? And that's all to say, looking at WASH from other perspectives, from economic growth, from the health perspective, and creating those multiple stakeholders and our leadership to talk about what we believe is important. Thanks.
Great, amazing. Thank you so much, Nancy. I think that was really great to sort of also end on, just this importance of the leadership angle and how we can achieve that change and reaching out of our sector. This isn't about, WASH can be transformational, as we've heard, but we also know that that transformation has to happen across the system and not just in what we might call a WASH system, which possibly doesn't exist, but when we look at our own little bubble. But so yeah, just really important takeaway. I'm not sure I've got any more time. So I think I don't, okay. So I am going to ask you to thank the panel for their insights. And we were very lucky to have you here. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna hand back over to Ruchika. Thanks, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us online and in person. For WASH systems, for this particular project, we're working on a learning note, but also working on a WASH Systems Academy course on gender and social inclusion in WASH system strengthening. So do keep in touch with us if you want to help in terms of building any of this material with any of your experiences or thoughts that you'd like us to reflect on in these bits. That's mostly it. And we especially thank FCDO to add in gender and social inclusion as part of the program that we're working on and helping us set this up. Thank you.